involves nutrition, doesn't look simply at epidemic diseases, thinks about education as well as containment, quarantine, and so forth. But for the time being, I need to concentrate on other things, particularly about the present dilemmas that face people in relation to pandemic disease. Now, I've given a very brief sketch of pandemics in the 19th century and before. My main reason in doing so is to show that there are certain themes which, even take into account the different circumstances of today, can really be illuminated by the study of the past. Now, first of all, before I look at the similarities, I'll look at some of the obvious differences. I mean, today, our fortunes, I suppose, are more intimately bound up with one another than at any time in history. Although I suppose it's possible to talk about globalization from the 19th century onwards, it wasn't of the same degree as it is today. The revolution in communications today, particularly the IT revolution, means that it's very, very easy for people in one part of the world to know almost immediately what is happening in another part of the world. And in some senses that's good because it provides a warning, but it also generates a certain amount of panic and fear, or at least is conducive to that. Obviously, the modes of communication and transport are very different. Today we have aeroplanes, making it even easier for diseases to move from one part of the world very quickly to another than, say, was true in the 19th century. The diseases which we are currently dealing with in epidemic form are also somewhat different from those in the 19th century. The one which is similar is influenza. That became a huge problem in the end of the 19th century, and of course that's still the major pandemic threat facing the world today. But there are many other diseases which are threats today which were not seen so much as threats, or at least on a global scale, in the past. And those are the so-called zoonotic diseases. These are diseases which are classified as, well, this is a classification of diseases which can transfer easily from animals to human beings. It's a problematic definition, but so-called zoonotic diseases, and I suppose something like BSE, variant CJD, would be a good example of that, but also influenza, of course. These zoonotic diseases are, in many ways, the weather vanes of the 21st century, in a way that cholera was for the 19th century. They show up, I think, not just how easily diseases can spread in our new globalized society, but they also, just like cholera did in the 19th century, they can show up some of the more unsavory aspects of our society, the aspects of it which we often choose to forget, just in the way that cholera did in the 19th century with the emphasis upon that it placed upon filthy conditions and the squalid environments in which the working classes lived. Now, I think that the period that we're living at the moment, at least as regards how epidemics are dealt with and as regards international public health responses, is very much conditioned by the arrival of SARS. And this is for a number of reasons, but it also, I think, is epitomized by the fact that the current director of the World Health Organization, Margaret Chan, she was somebody who was very much involved in dealing firsthand with SARS, with the SARS outbreaks in 2003 to 4. And so her experiences, like I think that many other international public health workers, were conditioned by SARS, and it reflects in the way in which they deal today with the problems of so-called swine flu. But one of the reasons why SARS is so important is because it came at a pivotal time in global politics, a pivotal time in particularly, I think, at a time of increasing insecurity in the early 21st century. It came fairly soon after the 9/11 terrorist attacks and other infamous terrorist attacks. It came at a time of mounting concern about the stability of the global financial and commercial system. And what many people around the world, particularly representatives of governments, began to wonder was what would happen if a really serious pandemic broke out. Would it disrupt the new globalized economy in such a way that it would really produce a global depression? Would terrorists possibly be able to get their hands on bacteria and viruses which could be used to do that? And many public health workers, rather than trying to dampen down some of these fears, actually played them up. There was a great deal of alarmism at this time. And one of the reasons why some public health workers were doing that was to get a better deal for public health within medicine. In public health really had, by this point, had become a Cinderella branch of medicine. All the funding was going into other areas, into medical genetics, for example. And there are many people who felt that public health really needed to improve its profile. And a way of doing that, as far as some public health workers were concerned, was to couple public health with contemporary concerns about terrorism and security. And this happened very much around the time of the SARS epidemics, or the SARS pandemic. Health began to, and epidemic disease, pandemic disease, began to be seen in terms of a threat to security. This was a way in which public health workers could make governments listen to what they were saying. And it led to a certain kind of response to the pandemic disease, or the threat of pandemic disease. And it was a response which, as I'll describe in a moment, which was focused in some ways quite like the responses of the 19th century around disease surveillance, containment, quarantine. And it really sidelined a lot of quite interesting new ideas which were emerging at that time in public health circles, about the importance of seeing human health in combination with the health of animals and with the health of the global environment. And these holistic approaches were effectively sidelined once SARS came along, and when health and dealing with pandemics became to be very closely attached to a new security agenda. Now, as I've said, public health workers, and I think this tendency began in the United States, but it spread very soon beyond that, began to identify pandemic diseases with other threats facing the global order, particularly terrorism. One aspect of this in the international arena was that it placed a great deal of emphasis upon individual countries or states to be seen to act responsibly in terms of the global community. And spotlight, of course, in the case of SARS, fell on China and some other East Asian countries. China was shown up, at least at the beginning of the SARS outbreak, by other countries and by the international health community for not responding quickly enough. Subsequently, China dealt with the SARS outbreaks very effectively, more effectively than many other countries. But initially, there was this hesitation, which provided the pretext for other countries to criticize Chinese arrangements and to place increasing pressure on any state to maintain very high levels of disease surveillance and also to introduce quarantine on a very rigid basis. This was something which was expected by the rest of the world. And many public health workers drew a very explicit analogy between acting responsibly in this way to counter pandemic disease and